Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host, Rashid, and I'd like to thank you all for joining me on another edition of the most powerful platform for truth, bar none, anywhere on earth. And without further ado, I'd like to bring in my colleague and my guest. He's a repeat guest. Yeah, we're going to call him a repeat offender on the Red Pill Diary, Mr. Lawrence Freeman. Um, how's it going today, Mr. Freeman?
Very good, thank you.
So Mr. Freeman, if you would give the people just a little bit a background about you who may have not caught the first show or who may just tune in while we're discussing some geopolitical matters.
Thank you very much, Rashid. Yes, I've been active politically since I was 17 years old, protesting against the war in Vietnam. And I'm now on my way to 74. I understand U.S. politics extremely well as an activist. And about 35 years ago, I started to concentrate on Africa. And as a result, I've been involved in many different nations and policies for Africa. I've made a couple dozen trips to Africa. And I'm unique in the United States because I concentrate on the issue of development. And economic development comes from human beings. Unfortunately, in the United States, both Republican and Democrat have no understanding of how to help a nation develop. And therefore, I'm usually in opposition to U.S. policy. And people seek me out because they want to know how I think about the world geopolitically and economically. So that's what I've been doing for most of my life. And I can't stop myself. I just keep doing it. And I have a website, Lawrence Freeman, Africa and the World, I created in 2017 so I could get out my views uncensored and be happy to have people join it. I'm also on Substack.com as well.
Mhm. Mr. Freeman, since you're uh, somewhat of a scholar on Africa and geopolitics, let's start there first. Um, what is going on in the Sahel? What is going on with the doubling down of colonialistic policies of the United States, Britain, and NATO, and how they're trying to stop the Belt and Road Initiative in the development of Africa outside of colonial power?
If you look at the situation you mentioned in the Sahel, where you've had now several countries have had coups. The most prominent in the news is Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where Mali and Niger have actually kicked out the French, and most recently Niger, where the United States had a $110 million zone base. They've had to leave as well and leave their base behind. So there's been a huge investment to use by the U.S. to use Niger as a surveillance capability. And of course, the French had several thousands of troops in the Sahel. And you also have the situation with Equatorial Guinea. Uh, but the reason for this, and if we look outside the Sahel, we see it very clearly. Look at what's happened in Kenya in the last month, where the young people have protested against the government, against the economic policies dictated to them by the IMF, World Bank. Look at the protest that just took place in Nigeria this past week. So, what I see when I look at all these situations is people are rebelling against poverty and hunger, both of which could have been eliminated decades ago and can be eliminated within the next decade if my policies were implemented. So, what you're seeing across Africa is a rebellion against Western policies, the policies of the so called rules based international order, which have no conception of development. And much of what the United States in particular, and Europe also, have done in the last few years, let's say the last 2 to 3 years, is to counter China. This is not a positive policy, and they won't counter China effectively because they don't even understand what the problem is. But the goal of the policy, and they publicly don't say it, but they say it in a privately Intelligence sources have confirmed this to me. Government sources have confirmed. Stop China. How do we stop China? Not how do we eliminate poverty for 500 million Africans. Not how do we bring electricity to 600 million Africans who have no access to electricity, but how do we counter China? So the rules-based order has failed. It will continue to fail. They will try to put a policy in here or there that may have some positive aspects to it. But their overall strategic thinking is Africa is an afterthought. It has no concern to them, but the only concern is the geopolitical chess game of countering China primarily and Russia secondarily. Now, this is not going to last because Africa, which will be approaching 2.5 billion people in less than 30 years, will be the center of political and economic activity on the planet because of the size of the population and the size of its young people. And therefore, if we don't start thinking clearly in the West about what strategic policies we're going to pursue, we could be looking at worse crisis in Africa and in the world than we're seeing now with violent extremism.
Do you think this policy of countering China, countering Russia, ignoring the pleas of the people of Africa, siphoning off the resources, the um, the color revolutions, the influx of terrorism, do you believe all of that is a byproduct of backwards thinking and colonialism and that exceptionalism of the West that feels as though Africa is their um, playground or their memory gland to keep their wealth going?
It's a continuation of colonialism. I mean, don't forget after the liberation movements, which took off in the 1960s, they began technically a few years earlier with the liberation of Ghana from the British and the liberation actually of Sudan from the British. But in the 60s, we saw maybe 2 dozen or so countries liberated from colonialism, which continued all the way up until 1994 when South Africa finally liberated itself from their form of colonialism. But the colonialism has continued in different form. The IMF and the World Bank, which was supposed to be a bank for international development, set up by Franklin Roosevelt. That was his stated intention, and his followers, Henry Dexter White, at the Bretton Woods meeting, was to lend low interest loans to help industrialize African and third world nations. That was what they intended. When Roosevelt died, under Truman and Churchill, everything was perverted. So the IMF today works to control, and the IMF and World Bank, to control economies. They say, oh, your currency is in trouble. So we can't lend you any money. But if you devalue your currency and accept our macroeconomic recipes, we will lend you some money. Now, they won't lend money for development. They will lend money to African nations to pay back old debts. Now, we could, if we really cared about African nations and other nations, we would lend directly from the bank, Export Import Bank or other banks, long term, low interest loans targeted for infrastructure investment, for example, electricity. We don't do that. We'll lend you money to pay back old money you owe if you accept our conditionalities. This is look, Nigeria, to take an example, the largest population in Africa at over 220 million people, which is projected by in less than 30 years to have more people than the United States. Their population is going to be over 400 million. We in the United States don't reproduce too much anymore. We've given that recreation and procreation policy up. Maybe not the recreation part, but the procreation. So the fact of the matter is, Nigeria is going to have over 400 million people. But what's the problem? The problem is they've never recovered from the devaluation and IMF World Bank taking over their economy in 1985. A friend of mine, General Buhari, was the military leader at the time. He recently became president for 2 terms over the last 10 years. He wouldn't go along with the IMF policy. So they cooed him and brought in a guy named Babangida. And he immediately devalued the naira, which was 134 to the dollar. It was worth a third more than the dollar. And he immediately devalued it to $1 equals 25 naira. And it's never stopped. And today it's about 1,200 naira equal a dollar. So people are starving and living like animals in Nigeria despite its wealth. And this is a potential all over. You probably followed the riots in Kenya last month.
Mhm.
They weren't going to accept IMF policy, though that's the form of colonialism. The United States and not the United States government, but the international corporations that make up the financial political oligarchy, they want the resources they always have, and they will continue to find ways to get them, but they refuse to develop the nations. So therefore, it's not even an afterthought. It doesn't even exist as a conception in the mind. The rules based order does not recognize that nation states exist to progress the people, to raise the standard of living of their people. That's why we have nations. Human beings universally will progress through progress of scientific discovery. But the West says we don't really want to talk about that. We don't consider that an essential policy. Our policy is the zero sum game. Who controls the larger portion of a fixed pie? Us or the so called axis of evil of Russia, China, and Iran? And in fact, there is no fixed pie. There is no status quo. There's either expansion or contraction. My policy of economic development, which is a natural policy that the United States was built on, expands the pie. So, therefore, there is a joint interest in all nations expanding the wealth of other nations and improving the lives of everyone, utilizing the capability of the creative mind that each human being has. But that concept doesn't exist in the minds of the rules based order. And therefore, they can't stop really China. They never will. They may go to war, they may attack, as we're seeing now in the war with Russia and Ukraine, but they can't counter them because they don't have anything to counter them with, such as economic development policy.
Do you think, again, everything you said, do you think that the reason that America and the West continues to try to underdevelop Africa and siphon off its resources is because they fear the rise of the continent into to full equality or to self sufficiency, so that if that happens, Africa rises into self sufficiency, they can no longer exploit the resources. Do you believe that is one of the main reasons why the policy is like that?
Well, certainly in their what I call perverted, diseased ideology called zero sum game, where they have to be on top, they don't really want, they oppose strong nation states. Because if a nation is strong, if it's sovereign, then it's going to conduct its own policy for the benefit of its people. And it's not going to be manipulated by the IMF, World Bank crowd or other political interventions. So there's always the drive to control political leaders in African nations or to get rid of those people who show a strong potential, just a potential to develop their nation. Just even if the policies are not perfect, we've seen African leaders who have stood up as nationalists for defense of their nation, even though I would have criticisms of some of their policies. We saw this with President Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Not all his policies were good, but they tried to coup him several times, regime change, because he was a strong nationalist of Zimbabwe. We saw this, of course, with Patrice Lumumba immediately after he was elected as the prime minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 1960. We've seen this in more recent times. I was very actively involved, and some people think instrumental, in preventing a regime change against Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia. That the war that was waged by the Tigray Liberation Front was a regime change war because certain people in the oligarchy of the West thought they couldn't control Abiy and that he would act independently to secure a more stable Horn of Africa, especially the waterway that goes from the Indian Ocean up to the
Mhm.
Suez Canal. So they actually were trying to get rid of him in this war. And I stepped in immediately in November 2020 and identified this was a regime change. And I became somewhat of a folk hero because people said, yeah, that makes sense. But now you can see Ethiopia still has a great deal of problems. They've just accepted an IMF World Bank deal, which I don't think bodes well for them. But it was a regime change, clear to me. There was a regime change against President Bashir in Sudan. Despite the weaknesses of his policy, it was better off than where it turned out to be in the last 10 years. So, yes, they don't want nation states. They don't want sovereign nation states that control their own currency and their own economy. And they don't want strong nationalist leaders who will defend their nations. And that's part of their sick ideology.
And could that be why there's an influx out of the blue of so-called terrorist groups, which a lot of people know, and I've had people that were in the intelligence community say that these are byproducts of Western intelligence services like Boko Haram and ISIS and stuff. Could that be a reason why they continue with the influx of terrorism across Africa to sow chaos to keep Africa off its feet?
Well, clearly, uh, these terrorist groups, violent extremist groups, do destabilize nations. I mean, Nigeria's had a very difficult problem. Boko Haram has been coming into the country now, I guess, going back to 2012. They crossed over from Lake Chad, which I visited in 2014. I was working with the Lake Chad Basin Commission. I'm one of the few Americans to ever be on Lake Chad because it's so dangerous. We had one guy at the front of the boat with a machine gun and one guy at the back of the canoe with a policeman. So, yes, these groups, there's two aspects of them. One is foreign intervention, and two is the conditions are ripe for the spread of terrorism. When I was traveling regularly to Nigeria, you could read the fact that the young people were recruited to Boko Haram not out of a commitment of Islam, to the religion of Islam, but they were offered money. They said, look, my parents are living in the Lake Chad Basin. The whole life has been destroyed because the lake has shrunk, which I developed a policy, worked with a policy to reverse that. But people lost their standard of living. And these young kids said, I'm not going to live like that. And Boko Haram was paying $200 a day, $200 to a Cameroonian or a Nigerian to join. So it wasn't a very hard choice. So, in other words, you have outside instigation, but poverty is the recruiting ground. It's fertile ground to get anybody because young people see no future in their life. And that is the overall driving danger because, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have 2.5 billion people in Africa. That's what's projected. 1 billion will be 35 years and younger. Now, on the one hand, this is a huge labor force potential. On the other hand, if those people don't have jobs, don't have families, don't have a house to raise their children in, don't have stability of a paycheck every week, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be part of a much bigger destabilization terrorist move. There could be more coups. There's even discussion, I'm not suggesting it's going to happen, but there's discussion that floats in and out about what's going to happen in Nigeria because there's 90 million people living on $2 or less a day. That's a powder keg. And if it blows in Nigeria with several hundred million people, it's going to spread to all of West Africa. Now, I'm not predicting that, but that exists as a potential. And this is a potential in other areas throughout Africa. So to me, unless you're committed to eliminating poverty, raising the standard of living of Africans, eliminating hunger, all of which can be done, they're not objective problems, then you're not serious and you're really not a friend of Africa, you're an enemy of Africa if you don't join in accomplishing those necessary goals.
And that's one of my points right here. Excuse me. With the policies of the West, they are purposely creating poverty and instability, which is the fertile ground for the so-called terrorist groups that they control or in some way had a hand in creating. And I believe this is a purposeful policy to keep not just Africa, but keep Latin America, Africa, the Middle East and Eurasia off its footing because they would have to pour so many resources, so much attention to fighting terrorism that they would not be able to focus on the building and the growth of their economy and industry and stuff like that, which would keep the West in a position of authority, and that's what I was referring to when I said, "Do you believe that the policies are an intentional policy to underdevelop Africa and the surrounding regions?" Just go ahead, go ahead.
Well, take the case of Nigeria, which I went through part of it. Since 1985, with the devaluation of the currency, uh, they really have never fully recovered. Now, some people may object, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this question. Now, in 2000, around 2009, 10, and so forth, we see the emergence of Boko Haram, and it continues to expand. Now, you had the presidency of Goodluck Jonathan, and he couldn't handle the spread of Boko Haram and counterinsurgency. President Buhari, who I know and I believe is a good person, he got elected again uh, for 8 years under the promise that he could, and he couldn't. Now we have the situation with the new president, President Tinubu. All of these presidents who have better or worse intentions, they can't control the insurgency of Boko Haram, which goes around killing and kidnapping people. So, in a sense, this proves your point. Nigeria cannot become a stable nation if it doesn't have security, and will never get security as long as it has almost half its population living in poverty and young men hustling every day in the informal economy just to make enough money to survive or their wife to survive, and the wife and the husband have to figure out each day how to hustle and eke out an existence of food to feed their children. So under those conditions, there is no stability, there is no security, and there is not sovereignty. And in fact, sovereignty is very elusive in Africa because to me, sovereignty means you have control over your economy
Hmm.
and your currency, and the government is performing its obligatory responsibility of providing for the welfare of its people, which is a beautiful concept that's in the preamble of the US Constitution. That's the job of government, and they can't do it. And so, therefore, we have to figure out what we could do to change that. And of course, you do have instigation of these terrorist groups, but really, if you have 500 million people living in poverty, which is now the largest number of people of any continent living in poverty, and it's the only region in the world where poverty increases every day. So it's growing, not growing as fast as the population, but it's not been curtailed or declining like it is in Southeast Asia. So this is the question. Now, this is not discussed at any competent level by the U.S. government. Biden had a Africa summit in December 22, and it was a joke. There was nothing new provided, nothing new said. It was a photo op. And again, I was told by government officials and the people who built that event, the unspoken subject, you were not allowed to say it out loud, but everybody knew it, was countering China. So how pathetic is that? That a superpower like the United States has a summit to counter another country, rather than develop a policy, even a joint mission with China, which I've been advocating for. I made a presentation at the United States Institute for Peace maybe 10 years ago. Why doesn't China and Russia and the United States join in a common mission to eliminate poverty and hunger in Africa? Nah, We want to compete, we want to control, we want to counter, we want to manipulate. We don't really have any concern about development. And that's the problem. In fact, I've written recently that the word development doesn't even exist in the lexicon of our political life anymore in the United States. It did on the Kennedy, it did on the Roosevelt, it did on the other presidents. But in the last 50, 60 years, you don't even have that idea discussed anymore. And that's a very sad statement about the so-called Western world.
And I want to play two short clips for you concerning the terror elements, and who controls them. And this is about one is about 56 seconds, and one is about 53 seconds. And these are very informed individuals that are talking about this. And I want to play this because this has everything to do with what is going on in Africa today, what is going on in the Middle East, and how they're trying to balkanize Syria and overthrow Assad, how they're trying to use terrorism to cement their position in Iraq, and to destabilize Iran, and how they use terrorism across the Caucasus and across the former Soviet territories in order to justify Western expansionism and Western domination. I want to play these two clips, and after I play the two clips, I want your thoughts on these matters. So we'll go with the first one. Here it is.
We created ISIS. I mean, ISIS is no less than the people up in Islamberg, no less than Gulen, is a CIA creation. John McCain, for heaven's sake, was over there with the ISIS officials. We created them. They came from the Al-Nusra group, the Syrian Liberation Front. These two organizations combined, and they morphed into ISIS. It's our creation. We create them. We still direct them. When ISIS warriors are injured in battle, where are they transported? They're transported, for heaven's sake, to Israel. They're treated by the Israelis in Israeli hospitals and brought back to battle.
Well, plenty of the rebels have acknowledged that they've been supported by Israel, and they've thanked Israel for helping them throughout. In fact, arms are oftentimes caught. Israeli arms are caught on en route to the rebel groups.
Now here's the second one.
Against the state of Israel, political plots, and others.
You tell the story about how you tried to find out what they call the Mossad when they deal with publicly?
I thought it was a reasonable question, but the trouble is you can't pick up the phone book. There's no Langley in Israel that you can look up, CIA, or in our case, the Mossad. We thought we should ask, what shall we call it in English? You can translate the Hebrew words, as I said, Mossad is institute, but when they write a letter to their friends in the CIA or the British intelligence, what do they call themselves? It took a while. It was a matter of asking the Prime Minister's spokesman. The best you could do, because officially the Mossad is under the Prime Minister's office. And I think he sort of wondered why you want to know and all that, so we explained. And he came up with the Israeli Secret Intelligence Service. I mean, if it were to have initials, it would be ISIS. Just simple words like that. Interestingly enough, a kind of a British model.
So, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there is much truth in what was discussed. I mean, if you look at the creation of ISIS, actually, if you go back to the history of the whole creation of terrorist movements, you go back to the confrontation in Afghanistan in 1980, when Brzezinski under Jimmy Carter were actually funding what became the Mujahideen, which employed Osama bin Laden. And these guys did make major contributions into creation of Al-Qaeda. And if you look at the situation in Iraq, when we went into this horrible war under George W. Bush, that not only destroyed Iraq and killed Saddam Hussein for no reason, he had control over many of the groups in a secular state or an ecumenical state. That went out the window. Paul Bremer disbanded the Ba'ath Party, which was a nationalist group that was had controlled the military. That was gone. And that helped the creation of ISIS, which is still existing today. So you look at these kinds of situations, you look at our support in Syria for the overthrow of Bashir. This is all operations that are designed to prevent the development of sovereign nations. in Iraq. Uh, we could have gone in a completely different direction. I happened to, at a later point, be working with Ambassador Joe Wilson, who was the DCM in Iraq, and was the last person in touch with Saddam Hussein. And he agreed. We could, he'd say he's a tough guy to deal with, but nevertheless, that's what diplomacy is supposed to do. Instead, we overthrew him on this bogus charge of uranium from Niger, yellow cakes, which never happened. Uh, Joe Wilson was sent there to see if it was true. A four-star general was sent there to see if it was true. Both reported negative. Yet we went ahead with that war. That war helped spread ISIS more than any other single act because it destroyed any concept of a nation in Iraq. So the idea is that the rules based order with the zero sum game, they either want countries they control and manipulate, or they want to have countries they would rather be destabilized, be in chaos, maybe be in war, rather than allow them to be independent and sovereign. And in the weaker countries in Africa, which never fully developed, they went from British and French colonialism primarily to independence, where the British and the French flags were brought down. But then they were immediately under control of neocolonialism through financial manipulation. And this history is very clear. If the West really cared about these countries, then we would have figured out ways to help develop the nation, use the resources to produce new wealth. Now, John F. Kennedy, when he came into office, did have the intention of working with African leaders. He overthrew the old Eisenhower Truman policy, and he went out of his way to meet with national leaders. And he had meetings with Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame Nkrumah came over on March 8th, 1961, president of Ghana, but the father of the liberation movement. And that was the first head of state dinner that John Kennedy had, was with Kwame Nkrumah. And Kennedy went to battle against the British and the world financial institutions to guarantee funding for the Volta Dam project, which produced electricity and was a industrial complex to take bauxite and smelt it into aluminum. And there's a plaque on the Volta Dam project today in honor of John F. Kennedy, who was killed, assassinated before then, before the 1966 completion. But that Kennedy was very unique, and Roosevelt was very unique, and they had a different conception. But since then, we've had no leadership in the United States that understands the importance. Because look, it's obvious. What is your foreign policy based on? It's really the same as your domestic policy. How do you develop and nurture the creative powers of the human mind, which exist potentially to be there, to be developed in every single human being born? So if we want to have a stable policy in the world, we want the other nations of the world to grow. We want to eliminate poverty. We want 2.5 billion Africans to be well fed, well educated, have industrialization, use their wealth to improve their standard of living, and they will buy products from us. It's the same thing we want to do for Americans. We don't have any either party or any leadership in the United States that understands this. But it's very simple to me. It starts from the question of human beings. We are the source of wealth through our creativity. Develop human beings, and you will have stable nations, productive nations, and economic, physical wealth will continue to increase from one production cycle to the next out of new discoveries that human beings make. This concept does not exist in the minds of the oligarchy, does not exist in the minds of the diseased rules-based order, zero-sum game thinking. That's the problem. And that is something that we have to get back to in the United States. Unfortunately, we don't have anyone championing that today in the parties, but that's what I'm fighting for.
Well, we'll stay in this region of the world real quick. Excuse me. we see the influx of terrorism across North Africa and across the Middle East, and we see as these terrorist groups are sprouting up left and right, we see more African nations reaching for true independence. They want to control their economic policy. They want to control who what their foreign policy is outside of the demands of the IMF, which is controlled by the British and the United States. And we look to the Middle East and we see that nations are doing the same thing. And while America is trumpeting democracy and international law, at the same time she is violating international law and pushing nations out of her I would say her orbit of influence with the policies that she's pushing vis-a-vis Iran. Let's just go there for a minute. First, Israel struck an embassy in Syria, which was, according to international law, a declaration of war, because the embassy is an extension of the nation itself. Iran responded, but responded very mildly when in comparison to what any other nation, vis-a-vis the United States, the UK, Israel, or any NATO nation would have done had they been in the same position. And now we look at the assassination of Hanaya in Iran by Israel. And the United States is deploying F-22s, F-35s. She has a massive amount of firepower in the Mediterranean, and is saying that they will defend Israel. Why isn't Lloyd Austin? Why isn't Joe Biden? Why isn't the National Security Advisor, instead of saying that they would defend Israel, why aren't they saying that they will defend international law, the thing that they trumpet so much when it concerns the violation of international law by their so-called quote unquote allies like Israel?
Well, when you start off on the question of so-called democracy, the United States says its main policy, and this comes from State Secretary of the State Anthony Blinken, and he says, yes, we want democracy, and we will export democracy, not export development, but export democracy. They're exporting structures, structures of the so-called rules-based order. If you agree to the way we conduct things, then you can be let in to our group as a servant, as a slave to the West. We'll accept you because you've accepted our so-called rules-based order concept of democracy. This is not democracy. That's the first thing. Democracy, in my mind, means a thoughtful, intelligent discussion of an educated citizenry about the policy of their country for the future. Do we have people discussing profound ideas that will affect their country? That means they have to have leisure time. That means they have to have electricity in their households. That means they can't be on the threat of a terrorist group. So a discussion of ideas, which is what Franklin and Hamilton and others wanted for the United States, doesn't exist because people don't even have the time to discuss ideas. So without this, you don't have democracy. You just have a top-down structure unless the people are involved, the consent of the governed, of the minds of the governed. So democracy is a phony construct that the rules-based order crowd is trying to push on the rest of the world. And by the way, it's not going well. Africa is not accepting this structure very, very well. You can see that recently in Kenya. But as you look at the situation in the Middle East, you described a bit of the military buildup. It's a massive military buildup. Several different advanced types of jet fighters, aircraft carriers, etc. This buildup in the Middle East, together with the fact that the head of CENTCOM, the command structure of the United States for that area of the world, has been in Israel twice and are coordinating policy, military policy with the Pentagon on an hour-by-hour basis. Defense Minister Shogu was in Iran. So there you have the two heads of two military operations involved in this conflict. My concern is that there will be a expansion of this conflict to not only a regional war, but potentially bringing in superpowers into this. Now let's look at the situation in Israel and Palestine. Palestine, it's a crime against humanity that the Palestinians have not had their own sovereign nation. You can't occupy people forever and not expect a rebellion. And this was understood going back to Moshe Dayan in the Six-Day War. He won the war, but he knew it was only temporary because they were occupying the Palestinians in Gaza and other parts of the West Bank. Rabin, who was the prime minister in the 90s, he worked out a deal with Arafat and called the Oslo Accords, which were the first time that Israel and the Palestinian organization, PLO at that time, would be able to jointly work for two independent states side by side. And this was a great accomplishment for Rabin because he was a war commander for 30 years and became a warrior for peace. And he died. He was assassinated by the circles around Likud, which is actually the circles around Netanyahu today, by a crazy Israeli. And he was assassinated because of his fight for peace. Since then, there's been no fight. So that's 30 years ago. Now, Netanyahu is running the most dangerous, oppressive, right-wing government we've seen in Israel. I'm not sure there's ever been one this bad. And he is eliminating people in Gaza. And the people in his group want to eliminate Palestinians. They want to get them out. If they can't kill them all, they want to drive them out of Gaza. So there's no intention of peace on his part. The United States really doesn't want to go into a war right now. I mean, the United States, let's take the current administration, President Biden. But he's being dragged into it because of this stupid ideology, the zero-sum game where we have to defend Israel against Iran. Iran is part of the axis of evil with Russia and China. So rather than finding a way to work with them, as we should work with every country, including Russia and China and so forth, we're going to join and let this extremist, insane person, Netanyahu, who's actually destroying Israel. He's destroying Israel itself by his policies. We're going to let him dictate U.S. policy because we have a commitment not to let Iran express its self-interest and sovereignty. And that is the idiocy of this policy. We should be intelligent enough to realize, okay, there's differences. Fine. That's what diplomacy is for. Why don't we figure out a way that all nations in the world can work together for the common interest, common shared interest of development of its people? No, we have to be on top. Zero sum. We have to control 51% of the world at the very least. We have to be the person who has a foot on the throat of the other people rather than the victim. We're the victor. It's victors and victims. Who's on top? And that's the mentality. And, people can speak in different language. They can wear nice suits and ties in the State Department and Congress. But underneath their ideology is very destructive. And that's what's driving us. And that could drive us, not in Africa, but in the Middle East. We can be pulled into by this insane, desperate leader, Netanyahu, into a war that could affect the entire globe. And that is the most pressing issue on my mind. It should be on other people's mind who are concerned and thinking about the state of the world today.
I want to, I want to address a few things, but I want to play this little short clip because it's something in this short clip that the War Secretary Lloyd Austin said, and I continue to hear this line of reasoning, this line of thinking in the Western press daily, and I want to address it after we come back after it plays, and then I want to get your opinion on it. So it's a short clip. It's about 41 seconds. So here we go.
Can you confirm if Israel is behind the strike that killed the senior Hamas leader in Tehran? And did you get any warning that this was going to happen?
I don't have anything for you on that. And we certainly have heard the reporting, but I don't have any additional information to provide. Yeah, so what you heard me say yesterday is that if Israel is attacked, we certainly will help defend Israel. You saw us do that in April. You can expect to see us do that again. But we don't want to see any of that happen. We're going to work hard to make sure that we're doing things to help take the temperature down and address issues through diplomatic means.
Well, he said that if Israel is attacked, America will definitely defend Israel. You saw that when in April, this is what he said. And this is the line of thinking that the Western press puts out. But I want to advocate something else. First of all, let us look at this as it is and not as we would like it to be or as the rosy scenario of the West puts it. Israel was not attacked in April. It was counterattacked in April. Iran did not bomb Israel's embassy, committing an act of war. It was the other way around. Iran responded to the bombing of its embassy in Syria, which was an act of war. So Iran did not attack Israel in the way that most people look at this. Iran counterattacked, meaning that they were first attacked. So now we have that here. And then let us look at where we are right now. Mr. Lloyd Austin says you saw that in April, and we will definitely defend Israel if they are attacked. So now we're in another scenario as with April's scenario. Did Iran assassinate an Israeli official or an Israeli guest in Tel Aviv? No. Israel assassinated an Iranian guest in Tehran, and not just in Tehran, but on the very day that the president, the newly elected president of Iran, was being inaugurated. So, why is this? Because I think it's very important that we understand words and the definition of words. Because if we don't understand words, then they can twist them and they can use them in a way that makes the aggressor the victim and the victim the aggressor. So, knowing that Iran did not do the attacking, but is responding to the attack, does that not nullify what Lloyd Austin is saying and what other U.S. officials are saying about coming to the aid of Israel if they are attacked? Iran has an inherent right, according to international law, to respond to the act of war that was committed against it. Why isn't anybody, any analyst, talking like that?
You could add to that description the fact that Ismail Hania uh, was the chief negotiator of the peace process that was going on in Doha with the Egyptians and Qataris. Therefore, when Netanyahu and the IDF assassinated Ismail Hania, they were doing it with the intention of provoking Iran. That's the point. They're looking to provoke Iran. They couldn't have picked a more perfect opportunity from their standpoint, because here he was the chief negotiator and he was in the capital of Iran, Tehran. And so this was a direct attack to kill the peace process and provoke a confrontation. Because Netanyahu, even though I think he's somewhat insane right now, he's clever enough to figure out how to drag the United States along. So what Austin, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is saying, and President Biden is saying, is we don't want to escalate the conflict. And I think from a political standpoint, that's probably true for President Biden, as you saw even with Kamala Harris yesterday being attacked because she doesn't defend Palestine. So I don't think they do want a war. But, and this is the problem, that Biden, Austin, Blinken, all these guys, they're controlled in their minds. No one's forcing them to do it. They have a disease. The disease is called the zero-sum game. Iran is our enemy. China's our enemy. Russia's our enemy. So therefore, we must stand with any other country encountering them. And as demented as Netanyahu is, he understands that. So he says, how do I, who have destroyed my own country, and I'm indicted on 3 different counts before this war started, how do I stay relevant? How do I stay in power? How do I stay in control? I drag the United States into a war because I know they will do it. So even though they claim they want to calm the situation, lower the temperature, And I believe that Biden, purely for election reasons, wants to do that. They can't get out of their diseased state of mind and say, yes, but we have to deal with Iran. And therefore, the facts don't really matter. It wouldn't matter what the facts on the ground were. They would defend Israel against Iran. And Netanyahu knows it. Whatever the contrived situation is, that's what they were going to do. And Netanyahu knew that in advance. And that's why he took the most provocative act possible, because he knew that that was the way to get the United States and drag them in. And sure enough, within 72 hours, the whole region is filled with new military hardware and equipment and weapons. That's the problem. The problem is we're dealing with a sick ideology, and we need political leaders who are going to stand up and break from that and expose it, and other leaders around the world who are not going to be intimidated by that. But until that ideology is defeated or isolated or marginalized, we're going to see more situations like we're seeing, although this, to me, is the most dangerous situation we've had in years. All we need is a miscalculation, a mistake, a misreading of the situation. An improper order is given, and this thing could blow. And it blows way beyond Israel and Iran. And that is a danger. And Americans should be very much concerned about what the United States is prepared to do in being pulled along by this crazy guy, Netanyahu. It's really a serious danger that we're all living under right now, at this moment. It could happen. I'm not saying it will, but it could.
I believe that there's already a few miscalculations. First of all, America is not the power that she was 20 years ago. America is not the economy that she was 20 years ago. America does not have the political capital nor the political might that she had 20 years ago. And I think by by bringing in America, this is sealing America's fate. Because think about it, she's already reached publicly acknowledged $35 trillion in debt. We already know that the private debt is the real debt is in the hundreds of trillions. We already know that. She has no manufacturing base at home. She is engaged in a major proxy war in Eurasia, in Asia and in Europe. When I say Asia, she's trying to encircle Russia and China. She's trying to color revolution a lot of the former Soviet republics. And then when you look at Europe, we see what's going on in the Baltics, and we see what's going on with Ukraine, and how the United States is trying to provoke more tensions with former Soviet republics and Russia to try to keep Russia off base. And then she is now also trying to turn Armenia into a foothold for NATO against a natural ally, Russia. How can this be a sane, coherent strategy to put yourself in a position where, in the Middle East, where America does not really have escalation dominance, the same as what takes place in Europe? Russia has escalatory dominance. It is a nation that is right there, so it does not have to import things across to try to maintain a war. When we look at the Middle East, Iran has escalatory dominance. The United States is now with multiple aircraft carrier groups, multiple warplanes. They're reinforcing their illegal bases across the Middle East. This costs tens of billions of dollars, even if there was no war or no explosion of war. This is unsustainable, especially when you're talking about pivoting 65% of your forces to to Asia, to try to confront your largest creditor, your largest investor, the largest military power, which is largest army, largest air force, and at the end of the year, largest navy, and at the end of the year, the largest air force, and the biggest economy in purchasing power parity, which is China. Aren't these policies insane and will lead to the collapse of the American empire and the fall of America?
Yeah, you've listed many aspects of the decline of the United States as a world superpower. And it's really a decline of the whole, what I've been calling the Western world's rules-based international order. And it is insane because it's only going to lead to further destruction of the United States and potentially further destruction of other countries. But let's look at the deeper problem here. What is producing the insanity? Well, the way our country was set up as a democratic republic, and this was well known among the more enlightened founding fathers, is we depended on the continuation of our republic on an educated citizenry. There's a famous quote after one of the sessions of the Continental Congress where a woman asked Benjamin Franklin, "What kind of government have you given us? An empire or a republic?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." So how do you keep a republic? You have to have an educated citizenry. Now, I just wrote a major article, which people can see on my website. We have been suffering for the last 6 decades a decline in the culture and thinking of the United States. Sports and Hollywood is taken over as becoming our new royalty. Our founding fathers outlawed royalty, but it's back. It's back with so-called celebrity actors and celebrity sports players. Gambling funds our economy. Casino gambling, lottery, betting funds our economy. It's a major portion of every state's budget. Look at the question of sports. Sports for young people are great. It helps you build up your mind, your body, your socialization of others. But look at spectator sports, where hundreds of millions of grown men and women sit in front of a TV every Sunday and watch other people performing athletic activity. We've stupefied our population. Look at the growth of the video culture and video games. I've never played a video game in my life, and I'm proud of it. Because video games are destructive to the mind and the soul of people. So our whole Western culture is declining. I recently had the opportunity to visit Italy, Florence, and Rome, and Greece. And I studied the Renaissance many years ago, and I studied the Greek culture. And it was inspiring to me to see the breakthroughs that were made by the human mind, to walk in the same agora in Athens that Socrates walked and St. Paul walked, to see Brunelleschi's dome in Florence, which was never, they still don't know how he constructed it, the largest dome in the world. It was a breakthrough in science, breakthroughs in architecture. The United States hasn't had that. Music is horrible to my mind. It doesn't nurture the soul. A great composer, a great playwright develops the soul and the mind of people. So we're in a decadent, declining culture. You go into the school system. I was a part-time teacher for a while. You see, we're not educating our kids. We're just giving them tablets, and they spend 5 hours a day on their tablet playing games and less than 1 hour actually reading. We're not producing the future generation. And then you went into the economy. There's over $3 trillion in derivative debt washing back and forth across the world financial sectors. So we're heading towards becoming the new Roman Empire. And we're going to decline like the new Roman Empire if we don't change our ways. That is the underlying cause of why we've accepted this Western view of the rules-based order. Where do politicians come from? They come from the population. If you have an uneducated, dumbed-down population, you're going to have dumbed-down politicians. And listen to these guys. I unfortunately do. I'm addicted to politics for over 50 years. And I listen to what they say. They speak in the shortest possible staccato phrase. Da-da-da, da-da-da-da. And the people respond, oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Look at that wonderful phrase. Democrats and Republicans. There's no concepts. There's no ideas. There's no development of a new thinking. So we're in the decline already. And this conflict in the Middle East, as you correctly pointed out, is an expression of our declining policies. We have the potential to be a great country. I've studied this country more than most people. I love the principles of this country, but we've betrayed them, and we have to reassert our principles. We need a new renaissance, and we need leaders who will lead that renaissance to save the United States.
In closing, I would like to piggyback, no pun intended, off of what you said. I often say on my show that this is the decline of the American educational system, and with the decline of America's educational system, it means the fall of America. Education, proper education, is what civilizes us, what gives us enlightenment, what guides us. When the leaders are so hell bent on maintaining power to your detriment, to dumb you down so that they can maintain their wealth and their riches, they don't realize that they're laying dynamite or nuclear bombs at the base of society. Because without the proper education, you have a dumbed down science, you have a dumbed down math. And think about this, these are the same people that are coming through the school systems that will be the stewards of the next generation. They will be scientists, lawyers, doctors. And if you have no real true education, how can you think that you can compete with China, which is churning out 18 to 20 to 30 million people with degrees every year? This, my friend, is the fall of America. On that note, what say you at the end?
I say amen. You said it well. You're saying exactly what I discuss with my friends and acquaintances. We are, by not educating these kids, think about it. There's a recent report that came out that 1/3 of third graders can know the basics of reading. 2/3 do not. Now, why is that important? Because in the theory of education, from kindergarten to third grade, you're learning how to read. From third grade on, you're reading to learn. So 1/3 are the only ones who actually understand the basic of reading. So as you said, these kids are between 6 and 11. 20 years from now, 15 years from now, they're the politicians. They're the business people. They're your government. And they're not prepared for it. So we are, as you said, we are sowing the seeds of our own decline. And if you want to look at one issue that stands out that no politician has discussed, it's the one you just went through, education. That's how you can tell if someone is serious. Because 10 years from now, I'll be a really old man then, we're not going to have any qualified leadership from these young people unless we start educating them. And that is the most serious flaw in American culture today, bar none.
Mr. Lawrence Freeman, thank you again for accepting the invite and coming back on the platform. I really appreciate it. I'll send you this copy of the show shortly.
Thank you very much. As we say in Arabic, shukran gazillion.
Thank you so much. Um, um, and Afwan. So
Yes.
I have to say to you,
Yes.
everybody, listen. We had Mr. Lawrence on. I want to thank everybody for joining me on the most powerful platform for truth. Remember what I always say. I love you if you love truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Do right by others, not because others are watching, but because it's the right thing to do. I want to say this before we go off the air. In the coming uh, week or so, we're supposed to have former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. We were supposed to have a journalist that is actually out in the field in Syria, but they had to go out. Something is breaking in the Middle East that I wanted to say before we leave. We had to rearrange everything because they had to go out back out in the field, but we have a lot of guests coming up for you all. Thank you all for joining me. Um, Remember, from my heart to God's ears, I want to say to each and every one of you, thank you for joining me on this platform, for spending your time. And we hope that the time that you spent, you got an equal or greater return. I'm going to go out the same way that I always come in, with love in my heart for each and every one of you. Know that I love you if you love truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. Hey, mama, look at your baby boy. I still love you more than life. Deuces, everybody. Thank you all for joining me on the most powerful platform. We're out of here. Peace. All right, we're having technicals. They're messing with